In 1823, the United States declared the Monroe Doctrine with a simple message: the Western Hemisphere was America's strategic backyard. 2 centuries later, that idea is quietly resurfacing, but in a very different world. China is investing billions across Latin America, building ports, infrastructure, and political influence just miles from U.S. borders. Washington is responding, not with gunboats, but with sanctions, trade pressure, diplomacy, and security alliances. This isn't nostalgia. It's strategy. As U.S.China competition intensifies, the old rules of globalization are giving way to something familiar: spheres of influence. The Monroe Doctrine is no longer just a historical policy, it's a mindset shaping how the United States views China's presence in its hemisphere. This new version isn't written in speeches alone. It's enforced through supply chains, technology controls, military cooperation, and economic leverage. The real question isn't whether the Monroe Doctrine has returned. It's whether the world is entering an era where great powers once again decide who belongs where. In 1823, President James Monroe introduced a foreign policy principle that would shape American strategic thinking for generations. The Monroe Doctrine warned European powers against further colonization or interference in the Western Hemisphere, declaring the region a vital sphere of U.S. interest. At the time, the doctrine reflected a young nation asserting its place in a world dominated by empires. 2 centuries later, the international system has transformed beyond recognition, yet the core logic of the Monroe Doctrine appears to be re-emerging. In an era defined by intensifying U.S.-China rivalry, Washington is once again signaling that influence near its borders is not merely a diplomatic concern, but a strategic red line. The return of Monroe Doctrine-style thinking does not come in the form of formal declarations or presidential doctrines. Instead, it manifests through policy choices, economic strategies, military cooperation, and diplomatic pressure. The United States no longer speaks the language of hemispheric dominance openly, yet its actions increasingly suggest a renewed sensitivity to external powers, particularly China, expanding influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. This shift reflects broader changes in the global order, where great power competition has replaced the post-Cold War optimism of globalization and cooperation. For much of the 1990s and early 2000s, U.S. foreign policy assumed that economic integration would dilute geopolitical rivalries. China's rise was viewed as compatible with a liberal international system led by the United States. That assumption has now collapsed. As China has grown into a near-peer competitor, Washington has reoriented its strategy toward containment, competition, and resilience. While much of this rivalry plays out in the Indo-Pacific, its effects are global, and nowhere is this more symbolically charged for the United States than the Western Hemisphere. China's expanding presence in Latin America is economic first, but strategic by implication. Through infrastructure projects, energy investments, technology exports, and development loans, Beijing has become a major partner for countries long considered within the U.S. sphere of influence. Chinese companies operate ports, manage logistics networks, and supply telecommunications infrastructure across the region. Beijing has also deepened diplomatic ties, signing trade agreements and promoting alternative development models that challenge U.S.-led institutions. From Washington's perspective, these developments raise concerns not just about economics, but about security, political alignment, and long-term influence. The U.S. response has been subtle yet increasingly firm. American policymakers emphasize nearshoring, regional supply chains, and renewed engagement with Latin America. Security cooperation has intensified, and diplomatic pressure has been applied to limit China's role in sensitive sectors such as telecommunications and critical infrastructure. Sanctions, investment screening, and strategic messaging all point toward a revived belief that what happens in the Western Hemisphere has direct implications for U.S. national power. This is the Monroe Doctrine translated into 21st century terms. Importantly, this modern version of the doctrine differs from its historical predecessor. It is not rooted in colonial ambition or territorial expansion, but in competition over influence, norms, and systems. Military force remains part of the equation, but economic leverage, technological standards, and political alignment now play a far greater role. The battlefield is not only land and sea, but supply chains, digital networks, and development financing. In this sense, the Monroe Doctrine has evolved from a defensive warning into a comprehensive strategic framework. The resurgence of hemispheric thinking also reflects broader anxieties about a fragmenting global order. As trust in multilateral institutions weakens and power becomes more decentralized, great powers increasingly prioritize regional dominance as a source of stability and leverage. For the United States, maintaining influence in its immediate neighborhood is seen as essential to sustaining global leadership. Allowing a rival power to gain strategic footholds close to home challenges not only U.S. security assumptions, but also its credibility as a global power. Yet this renewed posture raises difficult questions. Latin American countries are no longer passive actors in great power politics. They seek investment, autonomy, and diversified partnerships, often balancing relations between Washington and Beijing to maximize their own interests. A return to Monroe Doctrine style thinking risks reviving historical resentments associated with U.S. interventionism. The challenge for Washington is to assert its interests without undermining the sovereignty and agency of regional partners. At the same time, China's engagement in the Western Hemisphere tests the limits of its peaceful rise narrative. While Beijing emphasizes development and non-interference, its growing footprint inevitably carries strategic implications. In a world where power competition defines international relations, economic influence cannot be neatly separated from geopolitical consequences. This reality forces the United States to reconsider long-standing assumptions about openness, globalization, and regional neutrality. The return of the Monroe Doctrine, therefore, is not about reviving a 19th-century policy verbatim. It is about the re-emergence of a strategic instinct, the belief that proximity matters, that influence close to home is vital, and that rival powers must be checked before they gain irreversible advantages. In AU.S. China world, this instinct is shaping policy in ways that echo the past while adapting to the present. Understanding this shift is essential to understanding the future of global politics. The Western Hemisphere is once again becoming a stage for great power competition, not through conquest, but through capital, connectivity, and influence. Whether this new version of the Monroe Doctrine leads to stability, rivalry, or resistance will depend not only on Washington and Beijing, but on the choices of the nations caught between them. What is clear, however, is that history has not ended, it has returned, reframed by a new struggle for power in a changing world. To understand why Monroe Doctrine-style thinking is resurfacing in Washington, one must first examine the scale and nature of China's growing presence in the Western Hemisphere. What began as limited trade engagement in the early 2000s has evolved into a broad, multidimensional relationship that touches nearly every major Latin American economy. For U.S. policymakers, this shift represents not a temporary economic trend, but a long-term strategic challenge unfolding close to home. China is now one of the largest trading partners for countries such as Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina. Its demand for commodities, soybeans, copper, lithium, oil, and rare earth minerals has reshaped regional economies. Through state-backed financing and long-term contracts, Beijing has secured access to resources critical for its industrial and technological ambitions. Unlike Western investment models, Chinese funding often comes with fewer political conditions, making it attractive to governments facing domestic constraints or strained relations with Washington and international financial institutions. Beyond trade, infrastructure has become China's most visible tool of influence. Chinese firms have built highways, railways, energy grids, and ports across Latin America under the broader framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. Ports in Panama, Peru, and the Caribbean have drawn particular attention in Washington, where analysts worry about potential dual-use facilities that could one day support military or intelligence operations. While China denies any military intent, U.S. strategists view control over logistics and transportation hubs as inherently strategic. Technology has emerged as an even more sensitive domain. Chinese companies, most notably Huawei and ZTE, have played a major role in expanding telecommunications infrastructure throughout the region. For many Latin American governments, Chinese technology offers affordability and speed. For the United States, however, these networks raise concerns about data security, surveillance, and political leverage. The debate over 5G infrastructure has become a microcosm of the broader U.S.-China rivalry, extending far beyond Asia into America's immediate neighborhood. Diplomatically, China has also made steady gains. Several countries have shifted recognition from Taiwan to Beijing, aligning with China's core political interests. Beijing has increased its presence in regional organizations, expanded cultural exchanges, and promoted alternative development narratives that challenge U.S.-led liberal models. This soft power push reinforces China's image as a reliable partner unconstrained by ideological demands, a message that resonates in parts of the region where skepticism toward U.S. intentions runs deep. From Washington's perspective, none of these developments are isolated. Together, they form a pattern, a rival great power embedding itself economically, technologically, and diplomatically in a region long considered strategically vital to U.S. security. While China has not deployed troops or established military bases comparable to U.S. facilities abroad, American policymakers increasingly argue that influence itself is power, and that power, once established, is difficult to reverse. This perception explains the shift in U.S. rhetoric and policy over the past decade. Officials rarely invoke the Monroe Doctrine explicitly, yet their language reflects its logic. Statements warning against external actors exploiting the region, concerns over strategic dependency, and renewed emphasis on hemispheric security cooperation all point toward a revived sense of regional defensiveness. The Western Hemisphere is no longer viewed as geopolitically settled, but as contested space. At the same time, the U.S. response has been constrained by reality. Unlike the 19th or early 20th centuries, Washington cannot simply dictate outcomes. Latin American nations operate in a more multipolar environment, with greater agency and leverage. Many see China not as a replacement for the United States, but as a counterbalance, one that provides alternatives and bargaining power. Attempts to force exclusive alignment risk backfiring, reinforcing narratives of U.S. dominance and interventionism. This tension exposes the central dilemma of the modern Monroe Doctrine. The United States seeks to limit China's strategic reach without reverting to coercive practices that undermine its credibility and values. Economic competition, rather than military confrontation, has become the primary arena. Initiatives promoting nearshoring, supply chain resilience, and development financing aim to reassert U.S. relevance while offering partners tangible benefits. Yet success is far from guaranteed. China's engagement is often faster, more centralized, and less encumbered by domestic political constraints. U.S. initiatives, by contrast, must navigate congressional approval, private sector incentives, and complex regulatory frameworks. The result is a competition not only between states, but between systems of governance and economic organization. Ultimately, China's expanding footprint in the Western Hemisphere has forced the United States to confront uncomfortable truths about its own engagement. Decades of inconsistent attention, economic neglect, and episodic diplomacy created openings that Beijing has skillfully exploited. The return of Monroe Doctrine thinking is, in part, an acknowledgement of this strategic oversight. As U.S.-China rivalry deepens, the Western Hemisphere will remain a critical, if often overlooked, front in the contest for global influence. Whether Washington can defend its interests without reviving the coercive legacy associated with the original Monroe Doctrine will shape not only regional politics, but the credibility of U.S. leadership in an increasingly competitive world. As China's influence expands across the Western Hemisphere, the United States has moved from quiet concern to active recalibration. This response does not come wrapped in a single doctrine or speech, but rather through a collection of policies that together reveal a revived Monroe Doctrine mindset, one adapted for a world of economic interdependence, technological rivalry, and multipolar diplomacy. At the center of the U.S. response is economics. Washington has increasingly emphasized nearshoring and friendshoring, encouraging companies to relocate supply chains closer to home and within trusted partner countries. Latin America has been reframed not as a peripheral region, but as a strategic asset in reducing dependence on China. Initiatives such as development financing through the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, expanded trade engagement, and support for regional manufacturing aim to offer alternatives to Chinese capital. Unlike past approaches, the goal is not exclusion, but competition, making U.S. partnership more attractive and sustainable. Security cooperation forms the second pillar of this modern Monroe Doctrine. The United States has strengthened military ties with regional partners through joint exercises, training programs, and arms sales. These efforts are often justified in terms of counter-narcotics, disaster response, and regional stability, yet they also serve a broader purpose, reinforcing U.S. presence and interoperability in a region where strategic influence matters. Washington remains particularly sensitive to any possibility of Chinese military access, intelligence cooperation, or dual-use infrastructure in the hemisphere, even when such risks remain hypothetical. Technology has emerged as perhaps the most consequential battleground. U.S. pressure campaigns against Chinese telecommunications firms reflect deeper concerns about data security, surveillance, and long-term dependency. By promoting trusted networks and encouraging regulatory standards aligned with Western norms, the United States seeks to shape the digital future of the hemisphere. In this sense, the Monroe Doctrine has moved into cyberspace, where control over information flows may matter as much as physical territory once did. Diplomatically, the United States has attempted to re-engage the region with renewed urgency. High-level visits, regional summits, and public messaging emphasize partnership, shared values, and mutual prosperity. Yet beneath this rhetoric lies a strategic objective, preventing Latin America from becoming a geopolitical swing region vulnerable to Chinese leverage. The Biden administration's framing of global politics as a contest between democratic and authoritarian systems reinforces this logic, positioning U.S. leadership as both a moral and strategic necessity. However, this approach carries inherent contradictions. While Washington seeks to counter Chinese influence, it must also avoid appearing dismissive of regional autonomy. Many Latin American governments reject the idea of choosing sides, preferring pragmatic engagement with both powers. Heavy-handed pressure risks reviving historical grievances tied to U.S. interventionism, memories that make the term Monroe Doctrine politically toxic across much of the region. This tension highlights a key evolution in U.S. strategy. Unlike earlier eras, the modern Monroe Doctrine relies less on coercion and more on persuasion, incentives, and competition. Sanctions and pressure still exist, particularly in cases like Venezuela and Cuba, but they are no longer sufficient tools for shaping regional alignment. Influence must now be earned through credibility, consistency, and economic relevance. Critically, the effectiveness of this strategy depends on domestic factors within the United States itself. Infrastructure investment, industrial policy, and political polarization all shape Washington's ability to compete abroad. A fragmented domestic consensus weakens external strategy, while China's centralized decision-making allows for faster, more coordinated action. In this sense, the U.S.-China competition in the Western Hemisphere reflects a broader systemic rivalry between political and economic models. The re-emergence of Monroe Doctrine logic is therefore not a deliberate revival, but a strategic adaptation. The United States is responding to a world in which proximity, influence, and regional balance once again matter deeply. The Western Hemisphere is no longer assumed to be secure by default. It must be actively engaged and defended. As this competition unfolds, the United States faces a defining challenge. Can it protect its strategic interests without repeating the mistakes of the past? Can it lead through partnership rather than dominance, and competition rather than coercion? The answers to these questions will determine whether the modern Monroe Doctrine becomes a stabilizing framework or a source of renewed tension in an already divided world. Caught between the strategic ambitions of the United States and China, Latin American nations are not merely passive arenas of competition. They are active players navigating a complex landscape of opportunity, pressure, and historical memory. Understanding the return of Monroe Doctrine style thinking requires recognizing how the region itself interprets and responds to renewed great power rivalry. For many Latin American governments, engagement with China is driven less by ideology and more by pragmatism. Chinese investment offers financing for infrastructure projects that Western institutions have been slow or unwilling to support. Trade with China provides access to vast markets and diversification away from over-reliance on the United States. In a region long shaped by economic volatility, these options carry real appeal. From this perspective, China represents leverage, an alternative partner that expands diplomatic and economic autonomy. At the same time, Latin American leaders are acutely aware of the risks. Heavy dependence on Chinese loans and commodity exports can reinforce extractive economic models and increase vulnerability to external pressure. Concerns over transparency, debt sustainability, labor practices, and environmental impact have grown louder. Some governments have learned that Chinese engagement, while less conditional than US or IMF support, is not free of strings. Influence follows investment. The United States, meanwhile, remains deeply embedded in the region through geography, migration, culture, security ties, and historical connections. For many countries, Washington is not just another external power, it is an unavoidable neighbor. This reality limits how far governments can pivot toward Beijing, even when economic incentives are strong. As a result, most Latin American states pursue a strategy of hedging, cooperating with both powers while avoiding full alignment with either. This balancing act reflects a broader shift in global politics. In a multipolar world, middle and regional powers seek flexibility rather than loyalty. Latin America's response to U.S.-China rivalry mirrors similar dynamics in Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The difference is that in the Western Hemisphere, U.S. sensitivity is heightened by proximity and history. Actions that might be tolerated elsewhere are perceived in Washington as strategic encroachment. Historical memory plays a critical role here. The original Monroe Doctrine and its later interpretations were often accompanied by U.S. interventions, regime change, and political coercion. While contemporary U.S. policymakers emphasize partnership and respect for sovereignty, skepticism persists. Any hint of enforced alignment risks reviving narratives of imperialism, undermining Washington's credibility and soft power. This is where the modern Monroe Doctrine faces its greatest test. If the United States frames regional engagement primarily through the lens of blocking China, it risks reducing Latin America to a strategic buffer rather than treating it as a set of equal partners. Conversely, failing to respond at all would allow Chinese influence to deepen unchecked, potentially reshaping the regional balance in ways that constrain U.S. options in the future. Latin American agency, therefore, is central to the outcome of this competition. The region's governments will ultimately decide whether U.S. initiatives succeed or fail, whether Chinese projects expand or stall, and whether rivalry produces development or division. Their choices are shaped by domestic politics, economic needs, and public opinion, not simply by pressure from Washington or Beijing. In this context, the return of Monroe Doctrine logic is neither absolute nor uncontested. It operates within limits imposed by regional autonomy and global interconnectedness. The Western Hemisphere is no longer a closed system, and no external power can dominate it unilaterally. Influence must be negotiated, not imposed. As U.S.-China rivalry continues to define the international system, Latin America's role will only grow more significant. The region is not just a test of American resolve or Chinese ambition, it is a measure of whether great powers can compete without coercion, and whether history's old doctrines can be adapted to a world that no longer accepts them unquestioningly.